Imagine a scene carefully staged for the cameras. Adolf Hitler stands amid a crowd of smiling boys and girls, their small hands clutching flowers, their eyes lifted toward him with rehearsed admiration. He bends slightly, pats a child on the head, and smiles, a rare softness crossing his rigid face. Photographs of these moments traveled across Germany and the world, presenting a chilling question that still echoes through history. How could a man responsible for unprecedented destruction appear so tender toward children? From the earliest days of his rise to power, Hitler understood the symbolic power of childhood. In post-World War I Germany, a nation humiliated, economically shattered, and psychologically wounded, children represented the future he promised to redeem. He spoke of them as the living vessels of a reborn Reich, untainted by defeat, ready to carry his ideology forward. This was not accidental sentiment. It was calculated strategy. Hitler believed that if the minds of the young could be shaped early, the future would belong to him long after his own lifetime. Publicly, Hitler cultivated an image of himself as a protector of German youth. He was photographed attending children's events, praising motherhood, and emphasizing the importance of family. In speeches, he declared that the state's highest duty was to safeguard its children. To many ordinary Germans, especially parents exhausted by years of instability, this message was deeply reassuring. It suggested order, care, and continuity. But beneath this carefully polished surface lay a far darker reality. Hitler's personal relationship with children was distant and abstract. He had no children of his own and showed little genuine interest in individual young lives beyond their symbolic value. Those who observed him closely noted that his interactions were often awkward, rehearsed, and brief. Children were not loved for who they were, but for what they represented, raw material for ideology. In Hitler's worldview, childhood innocence was not something to be protected, but something to be exploited. This exploitation took institutional form with the creation and expansion of the Hitler Youth. What began in the 1920s as a party-affiliated organization became, after 1933, a compulsory mass movement. Boys and girls were systematically removed from the private influence of their families and placed under the authority of the state. Loyalty to parents, teachers, and even the church was slowly replaced with loyalty to Hitler alone. He was not merely a political leader. He was presented as a father figure, the ultimate source of truth and purpose. The psychological consequences were profound. Children were taught to see the world in stark, unforgiving terms: strength versus weakness, loyalty versus betrayal, purity versus corruption. Compassion was framed as softness. Critical thought was dismissed as doubt. By encouraging children to inform on parents or teachers who criticized the regime, the Nazi state deliberately fractured families. Trust eroded inside homes, replaced by fear and suspicion. This was not a side effect, it was a goal. A child who answered first to the Führer could be shaped without resistance. Girls, too, were carefully molded. While boys were trained for war, girls were prepared for motherhood within a rigid racial ideology. Their value was measured not by intellect or independence, but by their ability to produce racially pure offspring. Childhood, for both genders, was stripped of freedom and curiosity. It became a pipeline leading directly into the machinery of the state. The contrast between propaganda and reality grew starker as the regime radicalized. While Hitler spoke of protecting children, his policies destroyed countless young lives. Jewish children were systematically excluded from schools, playgrounds, and public life long before they were deported and murdered. Disabled children, labeled as unfit, became victims of the so-called euthanasia program, quietly killed in hospitals under state supervision. These acts were not contradictions of Hitler's vision, they were its logical outcome. In his mind, only certain children deserved to live. As the Second World War intensified, the regime's true priorities became impossible to hide. Teenage boys were pulled from classrooms and sent to the front lines. Children manned anti-aircraft guns as Allied bombs fell around them. In the final months of the war, Hitler ordered even younger boys into combat, sacrificing them in a desperate attempt to delay defeat. The same children once paraded as symbols of hope were now treated as expendable resources. Psychologically, this reveals a chilling consistency. Hitler's apparent affection for children was never rooted in empathy. It was rooted in control. He saw humanity through the lens of utility, what served his vision and what did not. When children served as propaganda, they were cherished. When they served as soldiers, they were armed. When they were deemed undesirable, they were erased. The human cost was immeasurable. An entire generation grew up under relentless indoctrination, many carrying lifelong trauma, guilt, and disorientation after the war. Some struggled to reconcile the ideals they had been taught with the reality of the crimes committed in their name. Others realized too late that their childhood had been stolen, reshaped into a weapon. By the time Hitler retreated into his bunker in 1945, the illusion had collapsed. The smiling photographs meant nothing against the ruins of cities and the graves of millions, including children. The future he claimed to protect lay in ashes around him. Hitler's relationship with children exposes one of history's most dangerous truths, that cruelty can wear the mask of care and destruction can hide behind promises of protection. When power claims ownership over the young, when ideology replaces compassion, childhood itself becomes a battlefield. This story is not only about one man or one era. It is a warning that echoes across generations, reminding us that the way a society treats its children reveals not its hopes, but its moral soul. Picture a child standing before Adolf Hitler, camera shutters clicking, flags rising behind them. The image suggests warmth, even kindness. But history asks us to look longer and harder. For Hitler, children were never individuals with inner lives, fears, or dreams of their own. They were symbols, instruments, and raw material. His apparent interest in them was not rooted in affection or responsibility, but in calculation. Children mattered to him only insofar as they could be shaped, displayed, and ultimately used to serve his vision of power. From the earliest articulation of his ideology, Hitler spoke of the future more than the present. He imagined a Germany reborn through generations yet to come, purified of weakness and loyal without question. In that vision, children were not protected because they were vulnerable. They were cultivated because they were malleable. He understood that adults carried memories of defeat, doubt, and moral complexity. Children, by contrast, could be molded before such complications took hold. To Hitler, this made them valuable, not precious. This distinction reveals the core of his psychology. Hitler did not form relationships in the human sense. He related to people through abstraction, ranking them according to usefulness and racial value. Empathy, which requires recognition of another person's inner world, was largely absent from his personality. Instead, he saw masses, categories, and functions. Children, therefore, existed in his mind as future soldiers, future mothers, future carriers of ideology. Their were was defined not by who they were, but by what they could become under his control. Public performances reinforced this illusion of care. Hitler's handlers carefully staged encounters with children, ensuring photographs captured moments of apparent tenderness. These images circulated widely, reassuring parents and softening his image abroad. In a society yearning for stability after years of chaos, such scenes suggested safety and continuity. But these moments were brief, rehearsed, and emotionally shallow. Those who observed him privately noted that he lacked patience with children and showed little spontaneous warmth. Once the cameras were gone, so was the attention. The true nature of his interest becomes unmistakable when examined through policy. Education under the Nazi regime was transformed into a mechanism of ideological conditioning. Schools emphasized obedience, physical toughness, and racial doctrine over intellectual curiosity or moral reasoning. History was rewritten, science distorted, and critical thought discouraged. Children were trained not to question, but to believe, not to empathize, but to judge. This was not education in the traditional sense, it was preparation. The Hitler Youth represented the most explicit expression of this philosophy. Membership was framed as a privilege, then enforced as an obligation. Participation consumed childhood itself, filling afternoons, weekends, and summers with drills, chants, and rituals designed to bind young minds to the state. Loyalty to family, faith, or personal conscience was slowly eroded. Children were encouraged to see Hitler as the ultimate authority, even above their parents. In this environment, individuality was not nurtured, it was dismantled. The emotional cost was severe. By placing children in a system that rewarded conformity and punished doubt, the regime severed natural bonds of trust. Some children reported parents who expressed skepticism or fear. Others watched classmates disappear after being labeled unfit or undesirable. Yet they were taught to interpret these losses not with grief, but with pride or indifference. Moral instincts that develop through empathy were deliberately dulled. In this way, childhood became a training ground for obedience rather than humanity. Hitler's treatment of children he deemed unworthy exposes the brutal clarity of his worldview. Jewish children, once classmates and neighbors, were excluded, humiliated, and ultimately murdered. Disabled children, regardless of age or innocence, were targeted under the guise of medical necessity. These were not anomalies or excesses carried out by subordinates. They were direct consequences of a belief system that measured human value by racial and physical criteria. For Hitler, a child who did not fit his vision had no claim to life itself. Even those children who fit the racial ideal were not spared exploitation. As war approached and then engulfed Europe, the promise of a glorious future demanded sacrifice. Teenagers were trained for combat with increasing urgency. By the final years of the war, boys barely old enough to shave were sent to the front lines. In the regime's final collapse, children were ordered to defend cities against overwhelming forces. The same state that claimed to cherish youth now spent it recklessly, as one spends ammunition. This continuity, between early indoctrination and final sacrifice, reveals the truth behind the propaganda. Hitler did not betray his concern for children. He fulfilled it exactly as he intended. He valued them as long as they served the future he imagined. When that future was threatened, their lives became expendable. There was no contradiction, only a cold consistency rooted in his inability to see people as ends in themselves. The aftermath left deep scars. Many who survived carried confusion, shame, and grief into adulthood. They had been taught to believe in ideals that collapsed under the weight of reality. Childhood memories once framed as honor became sources of pain. Some struggled to forgive themselves for loyalty freely given under manipulation. Others mourned not only lost friends and siblings, but the childhood they never truly had. Hitler's relationship with children forces us to confront a disturbing lesson. Care can be feigned. Protection can be promised while harm is prepared. When power claims authority over the young, reducing them to symbols of ideology, rather than recognizing them as human beings, the consequences are devastating.
This history reminds us that the true measure of leadership is not how convincingly it speaks about the future, but how genuinely it respects the lives entrusted to it in the present. He understood something fundamental about fear and hope in a wounded nation. People who have lost everything cling most fiercely to the promise of protection. After Germany's defeat in the First World War, childhood became a symbol of what might still be saved. Adolf Hitler exploited this symbol with ruthless precision. He did not merely speak about children. He wrapped his entire public image around them, crafting the illusion of a leader who cared deeply for the innocent and the vulnerable.
This image was not an expression of compassion. It was a strategic performance designed to disarm suspicion and secure loyalty. From the beginning of his rise, Hitler was acutely aware of how he was perceived. His speeches were fiery, aggressive, and often terrifying, but propaganda softened these edges. Carefully selected photographs showed him smiling beside children, accepting flowers from young girls, or listening attentively to boys in uniform. These images circulated wide, in newspapers, posters, and magazines, presenting a gentler version of a man otherwise associated with rage and violence. For parents who feared instability more than tyranny, these scenes were reassuring. They suggested that whatever harsh measures Hitler proposed, he would at least safeguard the next generation. This illusion was essential to the regime's survival. A dictatorship cannot rely on terror alone. It must also cultivate consent. By presenting himself as a protector of children, Hitler positioned the Nazi state as a guardian of family, morality, and national continuity. He spoke often of responsibility, of duty toward youth, of building a world where German children would never again suffer humiliation or hunger. These promises resonated deeply in a society still haunted by wartime deprivation and political chaos. Yet the language of care masked a transfer of ownership. In Nazi ideology, children did not primarily belong to their families. They belonged to the nation, and by extension, to Hitler himself. Propaganda framed this transfer as noble and necessary. Parents were told that surrendering influence over their children was an act of patriotism. Trusting the state was portrayed as an expression of love. Resistance, by contrast, was depicted as selfishness or weakness. The power of this messaging lay in its emotional manipulation. By invoking children, Hitler bypassed rational debate and appealed directly to instinct. To question him became, in subtle ways, to question the future safety of one's own family. Propaganda posters showed smiling, healthy children beneath slogans about loyalty and obedience. Films depicted joyful youth thriving under Nazi guidance. The message was relentless and clear. This leader cares for what you care for most. Internationally, the same strategy softened Hitler's image. Foreign journalists and diplomats were shown carefully orchestrated scenes of children greeting him warmly. These moments complicated efforts to portray him as a dangerous extremist. A man who smiled at children, the propaganda implied, could not possibly harbor genocidal intentions. This deception bought the regime valuable time, delaying opposition and dulling the urgency of external warnings. Psychologically, this manipulation reveals Hitler's profound understanding of symbolism. He did not need to genuinely love children to use them effectively. He needed only to understand what they represented in the collective imagination. Childhood signified innocence, continuity, and hope. By placing himself beside these symbols, he absorbed their meaning. The leader became inseparable from the future itself, but the gap between image and intent widened with every passing year. While propaganda celebrated protection, policy enacted control. Education was centralized, youth organizations expanded, and independent influences were eliminated. Children were praised publicly, while being privately stripped of autonomy. The state that claimed to shield them also monitored them, disciplined them, and prepared them for sacrifice. The contradiction became most visible to those who fell outside the propaganda's frame. Jewish families watched as their children were excluded, mocked, and eventually erased, while posters still proclaimed a state devoted to youth. Disabled children disappeared from institutions under the banner of national health. The promise of protection was never universal. It was conditional, selective, and brutally enforced. As war approached, the protective rhetoric intensified even as reality grew harsher. Hitler spoke of defending children from enemies abroad while sending their older siblings to die on distant fronts. The language of care became inseparable from the language of war. To protect the future, The present had to be sacrificed. Propaganda justified this logic repeatedly, until contradiction itself vanished beneath repetition. In the end, the illusion collapsed under the weight of destruction. Bombed cities, orphaned children, and mass graves exposed the lie at the heart of the narrative. The man who claimed to protect youth had consumed it. The smiling photographs survived, but their meaning was hollow, stripped of credibility by the evidence of suffering. This manipulation of childhood stands as one of the regime's most insidious achievements. It demonstrates how easily symbols of innocence can be weaponized, how care can be simulated, and how protection can become a pathway to control. Hitler's use of children in propaganda was not a peripheral detail of his rule. It was central to how he gained trust, neutralized doubt, and sustained power. It reminds us that when leaders place themselves between parents and children, speaking the language of guardianship, the cost of believing them can be measured not in promises kept, but in lives lost. It began quietly, almost invisibly, as many of the most dangerous transformations do. At first, parents were told that the state merely wished to assist in shaping strong, disciplined youth. Then, gradually, authority shifted. What had once been the private domain of families, values, morals, loyalty, belief, was claimed by the Nazi state as its rightful territory. At the center of this shift stood Adolf Hitler, who understood that true power over a nation did not come from controlling adults alone, but from reshaping children before they were capable of resistance. The family had long been the primary source of identity for German children. Parents taught right and wrong, loyalty and responsibility, faith and doubt. Hitler viewed this independent influence as a threat. Families produced diversity of thought, emotional, bonds stronger than political allegiance, and moral frameworks that could conflict with ideology. To secure unquestioning loyalty, these bonds had to be weakened. The solution was not to abolish the family outright, but to slowly hollow out its authority and replace it with the state. The Hitler Youth became the primary instrument of this transformation. What was presented publicly as a wholesome organization promoting fitness, camaraderie, and national pride was, in reality, a carefully engineered system of psychological realignment. Children were drawn in through excitement, uniforms, songs, and a sense of belonging. For many, especially those from unstable or impoverished homes, it offered structure and recognition. But beneath this appeal lay a deliberate strategy to ensure that the child's strongest emotional connection was no longer to parents, but to the movement and ultimately to Hitler himself. Meetings were frequent, time-consuming, and mandatory. Weekends, evenings, and holidays were absorbed into state activities. The more time children spent under Nazi supervision, the less time they spent at home. This was not incidental. It reduced parental influence and normalized the idea that the state, not the family, was the primary guide in a child's life. Instructions, rewards, and punishments came from uniformed leaders, not mothers or fathers. Authority was redefined. Language played a crucial role. Children were taught to address Hitler as the embodiment of the nation's will, a figure above ordinary human relationships. Loyalty to him was framed as moral duty. Loyalty to parents, if it conflicted with state doctrine, was portrayed as weakness. This inversion of values created an internal conflict within the child, one the regime carefully resolved by rewarding obedience to ideology and discouraging empathy for dissent. The erosion of trust inside family followed naturally. Children were encouraged to report anti-state remarks made at home. This practice was framed not as betrayal, but as courage. Silence became suspicious. Fear entered private conversations. Parents learned to measure their words carefully, aware that their own children might unknowingly become instruments of surveillance. The home, once a refuge, became an extension of the state's reach. Psychologically, this had devastating effects. Children learned that love was conditional, granted by authority when obedience was displayed and withdrawn when it was not. Moral judgment was replaced by rule following. Right and wrong were no longer determined by conscience, but by alignment with ideology. Over time, this conditioning dulled natural empathy and replaced it with rigid certainty. Doubt became dangerous. Compassion became weakness. Education reinforced this process. Teachers were expected to act as ideological agents, not independent mentors. Lessons emphasized racial hierarchy, militarism, and unquestioning loyalty. Subjects that encouraged critical thinking were reshaped or minimized. History was rewritten to glorify struggle and sacrifice. Science was distorted to justify exclusion and violence. The classroom became a continuation of the same message delivered by youth organizations. The state knows best. The consequences of this transformation were not immediate, but they were profound. Children raised in this environment grew accustomed to obedience as virtue. Many lost the ability to think independently, to question authority, or to recognize moral complexity. When orders came, whether to ostracize classmates, to participate in violence, or to go to war, they were framed as natural extensions of duty learned since childhood. For parents, the loss was deeply personal. Many watched their children change before their eyes, adopting slogans instead of conversation, suspicion instead of affection. Attempts to intervene were often futile and sometimes dangerous. Resistance risked social isolation, arrest, or worse. The state had positioned itself not only as stronger than the family, but as morally superior to it. As the war intensified, the regime's investment in this strategy became brutally clear. The same children once told they were the future were now told they must sacrifice that future. Teenage boys were mobilized with little training, armed with ideology more than equipment. They obeyed, not because they fully understood the stakes, but because obedience had been taught as the highest form of honor. The family's voice, once a possible restraint, had been largely silenced. In the aftermath of defeat, the psychological damage surfaced fully. Many former members of the Hitler Youth struggled to reconcile their upbringing with the reality of what had been done. Guilt, confusion, and emotional numbness haunted a generation. They had been taught to replace family bonds with ideological loyalty, only to watch that ideology collapse into ruin. Relearning trust, empathy, and independent thought proved painfully difficult. This deliberate replacement of family influence with state control reveals one of the most chilling aspects of Hitler's rule. It was not satisfied with obedience in public, it sought obedience in the private heart. By targeting children, the regime ensured that resistance would weaken with each passing year. The family, once the foundation of moral continuity, was transformed into a fragile structure overshadowed by power. The lesson is stark and enduring. When a state claims moral authority over children, positioning itself above parents and conscience, it does more than educate, it reshapes humanity itself. Hitler's success in this endeavor was not total, but it was devastating enough to remind us that the destruction of freedom often begins not with force, but with the quiet redefinition of who a child belongs to. The promise was always framed in the language of protection. Adolf Hitler spoke endlessly of safeguarding the future, of defending German youth from decay and danger. Yet embedded within this promise was a fatal condition: not all children qualified. From the moment Nazi ideology took hold, childhood ceased to be a universal state of innocence. It became a category judged, measured, and sorted. For those deemed undesirable, the state's concern did not extend to care or correction, but to removal. What followed was one of the most horrifying chapters in modern history, in which millions of children suffered, vanished, or died, not despite government policy, but because of it. The foundations were laid early, long before mass deportations and killing centers, Nazi racial theory redefined human worth. Children were classified according to ancestry, physical ability, and perceived genetic value. This worldview was presented as science, stripped of empathy and cloaked in authority. By reducing human life to biological calculation, the regime made cruelty appear rational and murder appear necessary. Children, unable to defend themselves, were among the first and most vulnerable victims. Jewish children experienced this transformation step by step. At first, the changes were subtle, but deeply traumatic. Classrooms became hostile spaces as Jewish students were singled out, mocked, and excluded. Laws restricted where they could play, study, or even sit. Friendships dissolved under pressure, replaced by fear and silence. These children were forced to mature rapidly, sensing danger long before they could understand it. Their parents tried to reassure them, but reassurance became harder with each new decree. As persecution intensified, childhood itself was erased. Jewish children were expelled from schools altogether. They were barred from parks, libraries, and public life. Their world shrank to the walls of their homes, and then to ghettos, where overcrowding, hunger, and disease became routine. Toys disappeared. Education became sporadic or clandestine. Play gave way to survival, even before deportations began. Countless young lives were already broken by deprivation and terror. The final stage was annihilation. Children were transported in cattle cars, separated from parents, and sent to camps, where survival was nearly impossible. Many were murdered immediately upon arrival. Others endured starvation, forced labor, and medical experimentation. The regime did not hesitate over age. Infancy offered no protection. The same state that claimed to revere youth extinguished it systematically, efficiently, and without remorse. Disabled children suffered a different but equally brutal fate. Under the so-called euthanasia program, the Nazi state targeted those with physical and intellectual disabilities, labeling them as burdens on society. Parents were misled with promises of specialized care. In reality, children were taken to institutions where they were starved, poisoned, or killed by lethal injection. Death certificates were falsified. Families were told their children had died of natural causes. This policy revealed the cold logic of Nazi thinking. Disability was framed not as a condition requiring compassion, but as a flaw requiring elimination. The age of the victim was irrelevant. Infants with visible impairments were killed shortly after birth. Older children were assessed, categorized, and disposed of. Doctors, nurses, and administrators became participants in a system that inverted the purpose of medicine itself. Healing was replaced by selection, care by calculation. Roma children were also targeted, their communities marked for destruction under racial laws. Like Jewish children, they were uprooted, imprisoned, and killed. Their suffering has often been less visible in historical memory, but it followed the same pattern of dehumanization. Childhood offered no shield against a system designed to erase entire populations. Even children who met the racial criteria were not spared harm. Those deemed fit were subjected to relentless indoctrination and militarization. Their lives were valued only insofar as they could serve the state. When war consumed Germany, this conditional value became brutally clear. Teenage boys were sent to fight with minimal training. Younger children were conscripted into auxiliary roles, exposed to bombing and violence. By the war's final months, children were ordered into combat positions that guaranteed death. This reveals the full scope of the regime's cruelty. Some children were killed because they were deemed worthless. Others were sacrificed because they were deemed useful. In both cases, childhood was reduced to function. Life was not protected, it was managed and spent. The psychological impact of these policies extended far beyond those who died. Survivors carried trauma that lasted decades. Children who witnessed deportations, executions, or the disappearance of classmates internalized fear as a permanent state. Many struggled with guilt for having survived when others did not. the destruction of trust between children and adults, families and institutions, left deep emotional wounds. Parents, too, were destroyed by these policies. They were forced into impossible choices, compliance or resistance, hope or despair. Some tried to hide their children, send them away, or falsify identities. Others were powerless, watching as the state took what mattered most. The pain of these losses cannot be measured by numbers alone. It lives in silence, in memory, in generations shaped by absence. Internationally, the world was slow to grasp the scale of what was happening. The language of policy obscured the reality of murder. Terms like resettlement, care, and health masked violence. By the time the truth was undeniable, millions of children were already dead. The policies had done their work. These atrocities were not accidents of war. They were the result of deliberate decisions, debated, documented, and enforced. They followed a clear cause and effect logic, rooted in ideology. Once a society accepts that some children matter less than others, violence becomes inevitable. Once the state claims the authority to decide which lives are worth living, no innocence remains safe. The legacy of this suffering confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. The greatest harm inflicted by totalitarian power is not only physical destruction, but moral corrosion. When children become targets, when their lives are weighed against ideology, humanity itself fractures. Hitler's policies toward undesirable children stand as a testament to how quickly cruelty can be normalized when compassion is stripped from governance. This history demands remembrance not as distant horror, but as warning. The measure of any society lies in how it treats its most vulnerable. When children are reduced to categories, when their value is conditional, the path toward atrocity is already open. The silence that follows is not emptiness. It is the echo of lives stolen before they had the chance to become anything at all. When the ruins finally settled and the banners fell, what remained was not only a defeated nation, but a haunting question that history still struggles to answer. How did so many people allow the future itself to be taken hostage? Adolf Hitler's manipulation of children was not merely a tactic of his regime, it was its most enduring crime. By reshaping the youngest minds, he demonstrated how absolute power does not begin with armies or laws, but with belief, especially the beliefs planted early, before doubt has learned to speak. Children are born trust. They look to adults for meaning, safety, and truth. Hitler understood this instinct with chilling clarity. He recognized that if authority could present itself as moral, protective, and inevitable, it would not need to explain itself. It would simply be accepted. This is why his relationship with children, though emotionally hollow, was ideologically central. It revealed a fundamental truth about human nature, that innocence, when captured by ideology, can be turned into obedience without resistance. The danger lay not only in what children were taught, but in what they were denied. They were denied complexity. They were denied moral ambiguity. They were denied the space to question. Instead, they were given certainty, simple answers to complex problems, clear enemies, and a sense of belonging tied to loyalty rather than empathy. This certainty felt like strength. In reality, it was a cage, one that narrowed their understanding of the world until cruelty felt justified and doubt felt like betrayal. This process did not require constant violence. It required repetition. Songs, rituals, uniforms, and slogans replaced conversation and reflection. Over time, these elements reshaped identity itself. A child raised under such conditions did not wake up one day and choose ideology. Ideology had already chosen them. This is how power becomes self-sustaining, not by force alone, but by internalizing control within the individual. The tragedy is that many of these children believed they were doing what was right. They marched, saluted, and sacrificed with sincerity. They trusted the authority that claimed to protect them. When orders came, they obeyed not because they were inherently cruel, but because cruelty had been normalized, framed as duty. This reveals a deeply unsettling reality. Evil does not always announce itself with hatred. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in pose, discipline, and the promise of belonging. The consequences of this manipulation extended far beyond the war. Survivors carried invisible wounds into adulthood. Many struggled to separate their own identities from the ideology that had shaped them. Some felt profound guilt for beliefs they once held without understanding their implications. Others experienced emotional numbness, having learned too early to suppress empathy. Rebuilding a moral framework after such conditioning was not simple. It required unlearning fear, relearning trust, and confronting painful truths about one's own past. On a broader level, the world was forced to confront how fragile moral systems can be when power goes unchecked. Hitler's regime demonstrated that laws, traditions, and institutions offer little protection if society accepts the dehumanization of any group, especially children. Once the idea takes hold that some lives are worth less than others, the boundary between protection and persecution dissolves. What begins as exclusion ends as annihilation. This history also exposes the danger of unquestioned authority. When a leader presents himself as the sole guardian of the future, dissent becomes treason, and obedience becomes virtue. Children raised under such narratives are taught not to think, but to align, not to feel, but to conform. The result is a population trained to follow rather than reflect, to execute rather than evaluate. In such an environment, responsibility becomes diffused. Everyone obeys, and no one feels accountable. The universal warning embedded in this story is not confined to one nation or one era. It speaks to a recurring vulnerability in human societies. Whenever fear is elevated above compassion, whenever identity is defined by exclusion, and whenever children are taught what to think instead of how to think, the seeds of catastrophe are planted. The form may change, the language may soften, but the mechanism remains the same. Children must never become instruments of ideology. The moment a society treats them as means rather than ends, as symbols rather than souls, it risks repeating the same moral collapse. Education should expand the mind, not narrow it. Authority should protect curiosity, not replace it. Power that demands loyalty without accountability inevitably seeks to shape the future by controlling the young. Remembering, this is not an act of guilt, it is an act of responsibility. History does not warn us through numbers alone, but through patterns. The pattern revealed by Hitler's relationship with children is one of manipulation disguised as care, of control masked as guidance. It reminds us that the most dangerous lies are those told in the name of protection. In the end, the silence left behind by millions of lost childhoods is not empty. It speaks. It asks whether we recognize the signs when innocence is being claimed by power. It asks whether we will defend the right of children to grow with dignity, complexity, and freedom of thought. And it warns us, quietly but unmistakably, that the future is never truly safe when it is shaped by fear rather than conscience. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes. The echo of this story urges vigilance, not only against overt tyranny, but against the subtle erosion of empathy and independence. For when a society forgets that children are not tools to be shaped by ideology, but human beings to be protected by values, it stands at the edge of the same abyss, staring once more into a darkness it should already know by heart.